March 2, 1965. The air over northern Vietnam was still and humid. Villagers in Vinh rose early to work the rice fields. Schoolchildren in Thanh Hoa sharpened pencils under palm-thatched roofs. In Hanoi, people read the morning news, wary but calm. Then, the sky began to growl. From the east came dozens of American aircraft, F-105 Thunder Chiefs, F-100 Super Sabres, and A-4 Skyhawks, slicing across the sky like silver arrows. It was the beginning of Operation Rolling Thunder, and with it, the war was no longer confined to the jungles of the South. It had come to the homes, the schools, the temples, and the rail yards of the North. Rolling Thunder was not a single attack. It was a sustained bombing campaign ordered by U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson. Its goals were clear, on paper: destroy North Vietnam's transportation and industrial infrastructure, weaken its ability to support the war in the South, send a message to Hanoi: negotiate or bleed. But the reality was far more complicated. That morning, the targets included the Army barracks at Quang Ke, a supply depot outside Giang Hoi, bridges on Route 1, the artery of the North. The Pentagon promised precision. The planes dropped 750-pound bombs with delayed fuses, napalm, and cluster munitions. Yet despite the mission objectives, the collateral damage was immediate. Villagers miles away from military sites reported explosions. Farms burned, children injured by shrapnel, hospitals overwhelmed. From that day forward, northern Vietnam lived with the sound of sirens. Every day at noon, every night near midnight, the air would tremble, and people would run into tunnels, into caves, into schools retrofitted with sandbags and bunkers. A 12-year-old schoolgirl in Ha Tin later recalled, "We learned to write underground. We did math between bombings, and we sang louder than the explosions." For the United States, it was a show of power. For Vietnam, it was a baptism by fire. And what the Pentagon expected to last a few weeks and would burn for 3 years. Over 643,000 tons of bombs were dropped. Yet the resolve of the North did not bend. Instead, the fire forged steel. This was no longer just a war of bullets, it was a war of skies, a war of fear, and a war of memory. The decision was made behind closed doors. On February 13, 1965, following a series of attacks on U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam, particularly the bombing at Pleiku that killed 8 Americans, President Lyndon B. Johnson gave the I-Bay green light. The message to his commanders was clear: we cannot allow the North Vietnamese to believe they can win. The Pentagon responded with Operation Rolling Thunder, the most sustained aerial bombing campaign in U.S. history up to that point. The objectives on paper, the goals seemed straightforward: strategic, destroy the North's supply routes and war-making capability; psychological, send a signal of strength to Hanoi and to the Soviet Union and China; diplomatic, pressure North Vietnam into accepting a negotiated peace. But the strategy was flawed from the start. The U.S. believed that sustained bombing would cripple North Vietnam's will to fight. They underestimated 2 things: the adaptability of the North Vietnamese, the unity of a population that had endured colonialism, famine, and revolution. The first strikes, March 2, 1965. The campaign began with airstrikes on ammunition depots and radar stations in Quang Binh province. That first day, over 100 American aircraft, mostly F-105 Thunder Chiefs, crossed the DMZ and released tons of ordnance. Initial reports from the U.S. military claimed high success. But what couldn't be measured in tonnage was the reaction on the ground. Inside the White House, Johnson was cautious. He demanded personal approval of all bombing targets in the first phase of Rolling Thunder. He feared escalation with the Soviets and Chinese who were aiding North Vietnam. As a result, American pilots were often forbidden from hitting key targets like Hanoi's rail hubs, airfields, and ports. Military commanders complained. They said they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. Yet despite the restrictions, the campaign grew, week by week. From 1965 to 1966, Rolling Thunder expanded to include bridges over the Songma River railroads in Vinh, power plants, warehouses, and barracks across Nghien, Ha Tinh, and Thanh Hoa resistance from the ground. The North Vietnamese were not passive victims. Within weeks they mobilized. Anti-aircraft batteries were installed around key targets. Radar-guided Soviet-made SAMs, surface-to-air missiles, arrived by mid-1965. Civilians were trained to fire rifles at low-flying aircraft. Entire villages moved underground, schools, hospitals, even small factories. Ho Chi Minh issued a national call to resist. The Americans can bomb everything, but they cannot bomb our will. The bombs and the people. Despite Washington's insistence that Rolling Thunder was a limited campaign, civilians bore the brunt of its impact. In Phong Nha, a single misplaced bombing raid destroyed a pagoda and an elementary school, killing 23 children. In Giang Hoi, an entire neighborhood was flattened after a bombing mission missed its intended railway yard. These incidents were not isolated. According to U.S. military records, civilian casualties were acknowledged, but often downplayed as regrettable consequences of war. International humanitarian organizations began raising alarm. In a 1966 report, the International Committee of the Red Cross stated, "The repeated bombing of civilian areas is causing unspeakable hardship. Women, children, and the elderly are living in constant fear." Growing frustration. Inside the ranks, American pilots faced mounting danger. Anti-aircraft fire intensified. Soviet-built MiG-17 fighters began intercepting bombing raids by mid-1965. Morale began to suffer. One pilot, Lieutenant Richard Tracy, later wrote, "We hit the same bridge 3 times in a week. It would be repaired within days. We called it the bridge that wouldn't die." Another airman remarked, "You could flatten a town, but the next morning the flag was still flying, and the roads were filled with more trucks." The results of the first phase, 1965 by the end of 1965, Rolling Thunder had dropped over 50,000 tons of bombs, damaged over 1,000 military targets, by U.S. estimates, destroyed at least 24 villages, killed an estimated 12,000–15,000 North Vietnamese civilians, figures from independent estimates and later declassified documents. Yet, the North's ability to supply troops in the South remained intact. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, winding through Laos and Cambodia, grew more efficient. Closing reflection, Operation Rolling Thunder was meant to break the North's back. Instead, it became a symbol of U.S. overreach, a campaign designed to win the war. From the air, only deepened the conflict on the ground. And in the skies, American bombers kept flying. And below, the Vietnamese people dug in, not just into the earth, but into their determination. The bombs didn't fall just on military targets, they fell on villages, rice paddies, schools, and hospitals. And the people of North Vietnam didn't just endure them, they learned to live beneath them. The sound of war for most North Vietnamese, in provinces like Nghệ An, Quang Binh, Ha Tinh, and Thanh Hoa, life during Rolling Thunder was measured by sound. The hum of aircraft engines far above, the wail of sirens that gave seconds, maybe minutes, to find shelter, the shriek of bombs as they tore through air and earth. In many towns, these sounds became part of the daily routine. "We went to school underground." That's how Nguyen Thi Le, a teacher in Ha Tinh, described it. Her class met in a hand-dug tunnel reinforced with bamboo. The walls dripped with humidity, and the children wrote on slates balanced on their knees. We memorized poems, between explosions. When the lights went out, we sang in the dark. Shelters and subterranean cities, as the air raids intensified, entire communities moved underground. Schools, clinics, and community centers were relocated into caves. Ancient temples were repurposed as bomb shelters. In some places, villagers dug entire networks of tunnels by hand, stretching hundreds of meters beneath their homes. The Phong Nha cave system, known for its majestic rock formations, became an impromptu hospital. There, doctors performed surgeries by candlelight, their scalpels trembling with each shockwave above. Adaptation and defiance. Despite the destruction, life persisted. Farmers worked by night and covered their fields with camouflage during the day. Fishermen memorized enemy flight schedules and timed their launches between bombing runs. Children were trained in first aid, fire response, and bomb identification. Being a city repeatedly bombed for its rail junctions and factories, the people began painting slogans on broken walls. Chung Toi Kong So, we are not afraid. Cultural resistance. Even in the worst of times, culture survived. Traditional hat cheo performances continued in village shelters. Propaganda artists traveled by bicycle, sketching murals of defiance on cratered buildings. Radio Hanoi broadcast poems written by schoolchildren in bomb shelters. One of the most famous voices of that era was a 10-year-old girl named Ngok Ha, whose poem was read on national radio. The planes roar, but we roar louder. My brother digs tunnels, my mother grows rice, and I write poems with my pencil of fire. Tragedy never far, but survival came at a price. In July 1966, a U.S. bombing run near the village of K-Tru missed its intended military storage site. A cluster of homes, a pagoda, and a makeshift school were destroyed. 27 civilians died. 13 of them were children. An American pilot interviewed years later under anonymity recalled, "I saw the smoke column before we turned back. I didn't know what we'd hit until the next mission. It was a school. I still see their shoes in my dreams." International reactions news of civilian suffering began trickling out. French journalists, Soviet documentarians, and some Western peace activists smuggled out footage of flattened villages and civilian funerals. In 1966, Bertrand Russell's International War Crimes Tribunal included multiple testimonies from Vietnamese civilians, some as young as 12, describing bombings of schools, wells, and marketplaces. Even some American lawmakers began questioning the campaign. Senator William Fulbright publicly asked in 1966, "If we are killing farmers to prevent them from supporting the Viet Cong, are we not creating the very enemy we claim to fight?" The strength of the ordinary. In the eyes of many North Vietnamese, the bombing did not break morale, it did the opposite. Villagers took pride in rebuilding homes from craters. Teachers passed down lessons under tarps and tents. Families refused to leave, even as neighboring hamlets disappeared. The shared struggle became a kind of cement, bonding communities, strengthening resolve. "We were bombed, but not broken," said a veteran tunnel builder from Thanh Hoa. "We learned that steel can fall from the sky, but spirit rises from the ground." The children of rolling thunder, those who grew up under the bombs, never forgot the lessons. Many joined the youth brigades, hauling supplies, patching roads, guiding convoys. Some became medics, others became fighters. But all of them, even those who didn't hold rifles, understood war in a way textbooks never could. They learned to identify American aircraft by engine sound. They knew the difference between cluster bombs and napalm. They knew what to do when everything around them was burning, and most of all, they knew who dropped the fire. Closing reflection, Operation Rolling Thunder sought to break the enemy's will. But it forged something else. A nation that learned to survive in the ashes, not in bunkers or command centers, but in classrooms carved from caves, in lullabies sung over sirens, in the hands of mothers holding children beneath earth and iron. The sky turned to fire, but the people never turned away. In the war rooms of Washington, D.C., Rolling Thunder was tracked on maps with red pins and color-coded zones. In the villages of North Vietnam, it was tracked in craters. And as the months passed, something became increasingly clear. The bombs were falling, but the North was not. The strategy that misread a nation. The architects of Rolling Thunder, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, General William Westmoreland, and others, believed that enough pressure would force Hanoi to abandon its support for the war in the South. They operated under a core assumption: the North Vietnamese leadership is rational and will respond logically to overwhelming military force. But this logic fundamentally misunderstood the enemy. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam was not just defending territory. It was defending history, identity, and unity. And those things cannot be bombed into submission. A people hardened by history Vietnam had already endured. 1,000 years of Chinese rule, nearly a century of French colonization, a brutal Japanese occupation. During World War III in comparison, American air raids, as terrifying as they were, only confirmed a belief held by many. Another foreign power has come. We have beaten them before. We will beat them again. The memory of Dien Bien Phu, where French forces were crushed in 1954, remained vivid. So when U.S. planes screamed overhead, many villagers didn't cower. They dug deeper, worked harder, believed stronger. The resilience of the trail. One of the primary goals of Rolling Thunder was to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline through Laos and Cambodia that fed the insurgency in the south. But the trail was not a highway. It was a living organism, constantly rebuilt, rerouted, camouflaged, and adapted. The more the U.S. bombed it, the more the Vietnamese innovated. Log bridges replaced steel ones. Bicycle porters replaced trucks. Jungle cover was extended and layered. Bomb craters were filled with dirt by hand, often overnight. American pilots grew frustrated. We'd destroy a segment in the morning. By the next day, it was like we'd never been there. A political boomerang, instead of pressuring North Vietnam to negotiate, Rolling Thunder galvanized domestic support for the war effort. State media broadcast footage of destroyed homes and weeping mothers. Not to demoralize, but to rally. Schools held essay contests titled, "Why I Will Rebuild After the Bombs." Posters showed farmers raising rice next to flaming wreckage with captions like, "Chang Jan, Chang Man." The more they bomb, the stronger we become. Even those who had hesitated to support the government in Hanoi began to see the Hai Americans not as liberators, but as invaders with no regard for Vietnamese lives. An intelligence failure. The CIA and U.S. military intelligence consistently overestimated the damage inflicted and underestimated the resilience of the North. 1966 classified report stated, "Despite sustained bombing, enemy infiltration into South Vietnam remains consistent. Morale in targeted regions remains higher than anticipated." In other words, Rolling Thunder was not working, yet it continued, driven by political momentum, fear of appearing weak, and lack of a viable alternative. The cost of stubbornness. Gas. The end of 1966. Over 150,000 bombing sorties had been flown. Over 180,000 tons of ordnance had been dropped. Civilian casualties were mounting into the tens of thousands. Infrastructure was heavily damaged, but rebuilt just as quickly. In many regions, the only visible result of the campaign was rage. Rural woman in Nagayan told a French journalist, "Before the bombs, I was just a farmer. Now I help load ammunition for the militia. The bombs made me choose." Backlash at home as Rolling Thunder dragged on. Opposition in the United States began to swell. Newspapers published photos of burned children and ruined villages. Activists demanded answers. Why are we bombing people who never attacked us? Draft-age students began resisting conscription, citing moral grounds. Senator J. William Fulbright, once a supporter of the war, testified in 1967, "We are not achieving victory. We are sowing hatred. Ho Chi Minh's gamble and success for Ho Chi Minh and General Vong Nguyen Giap, Rolling Thunder was both a threat and a gift. It threatened the economy, agriculture, and civilian morale, but it also gave them a unifying force: American aggression. They doubled down, not by building more tanks, but by fortifying their people. Songs, stories, slogans, education that stressed history, sacrifice, and anti-colonial pride. The bombs fell, but the spirit rose. Closing reflection. Rolling Thunder was meant to burn bridges, break roads, and destroy resolve. It did the first two, but failed utterly at the third. What it couldn't destroy was the memory of independence, the pride of AE, people who refused to kneel, and the belief, deep and ancient, that this land, soaked in blood, belonged to them, and the longer it rained fire, the more certain it became. This was not the beginning of surrender. It was the forging of defiance. While the skies over North Vietnam burned, a different kind of fire was rising across the Pacific, one that didn't come from bombs, but from voices. In lecture halls, church basements, kitchen tables, and public squares, Americans were asking a question their leaders didn't want to answer. Why are we doing this? The seeds of doubt. When Operation Rolling Thunder began in 1965, most Americans still supported U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Polls showed that many believed in the domino theory, the idea that if Vietnam fell to communism, all of Southeast Asia would follow. President Lyndon B. Johnson reassured the public, "We seek no wider war. We only want peace and stability in Asia." But as footage of airstrikes and civilian casualties began to surface, broadcast by networks like CBS and NBC, public perception began to shift. The image of a burning Vietnamese village broadcast on evening news became harder to reconcile with promises of peace. The first major voices in April 1965, just 1 month into Rolling Thunder, Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon delivered a chilling warning on the Senate floor. "We are being led into a war by deception, and we are bombing people who are no threat to the United States." Soon after, Senator Ernest Gruening echoed, "We are building a monument to hypocrisy in the name of democracy." They were dismissed by the White House as outliers, but they had lit the match. Students begin to stir in. October 1965, over 20,000 students gathered in Washington, D.C. for the first national anti-war protest. They carried signs that read, "Bombing for peace is like screwing for virginity." Hell, no, we won't go. Stop Rolling Thunder, start listening. College campuses from Berkeley to Harvard saw teach-ins, debates, and walkouts. Professors criticized the morality of bombing civilian regions. Veterans began returning home with haunted eyes and stories that contradicted the official line. The media turns by 1966. Even mainstream media outlets began to question the war. The New York Times, Time magazine, and the Washington Post published editorials asking whether the bombing campaign was effective or simply cruel. In a now iconic 1967 broadcast, Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man on television, told his viewers, "The Vietnam War is mired in stalemate, and the light at the end of the tunnel may be an oncoming train." For millions of Americans, it was the first time someone said aloud what they feared was true. The draft divide as U.S. troop levels surged, from 23,000 in 1964 to over 400,000. By 1966, the Selective Service draft became a national flashpoint. Young men from working-class families were disproportionately conscripted. College students and the wealthy found loopholes. African Americans, despite making up a smaller share of the population, were drafted at higher rates. Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, famously refused to be drafted. In 1967, "No Viet Cong ever called me racial slur. I have no quarrel with them." He was stripped of his title, banned from boxing, but became a hero to millions. Mothers speak out. Perhaps most powerful were the mothers. Women Strike for Peace, a grassroots group, organized vigils, marches, and hunger strikes. They carried photographs of bombed Vietnamese children and asked, "Is this how we teach peace?" In churches and community halls, mothers who had lost sons in Vietnam sat beside Vietnamese refugees, crying over shared grief. One sign held by a woman in Chicago read, "I gave my son to stop communism. He came back in a box, and communism is still there." Government pushback. The Johnson administration responded with a mix of denial and suppression. Protesters were surveilled by the FBI under COINTELPRO. Black leaders who spoke against the war, like Martin Luther King Jr., were publicly discredited. The Pentagon released sanitized reports describing Rolling Thunder as surgically precise, despite growing evidence to the contrary. But the truth kept leaking. And with every funeral, with every letter home from a disillusioned soldier, the narrative eroded. A nation divided by 1967, America was no longer fighting just in Vietnam. It was fighting itself. college students versus ROTC recruiters, civil rights leaders versus nationalists, mothers versus military spokesmen, veterans versus flag-waving parades. The war had become more than foreign policy. It had become a moral wound, and Rolling Thunder, once touted as a calculated strategy, was increasingly seen as a blunt instrument of despair. Closing reflection, Rolling Thunder dropped hundreds of thousands of bombs on a distant country, but its loudest echoes were heard at home, in living rooms, in classrooms, in the hearts of Americans who once trusted their government, and now asked, "What have we become?" The protests didn't stop the bombing, not yet, but they lit a fuse, and when it burned long enough, even Washington would feel the heat. From 1965 to 1968, over 643,000 tons of bombs fell on North Vietnam, more than the entire Pacific theater of World War II, more than the bombs dropped on Germany and Japan combined. And yet, the war didn't end. The government in Hanoi did not collapse. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was never severed. The people of Vietnam, from Vinh to Ha Tin to Hanoi, refused to surrender. Rolling Thunder had failed, not just as a military campaign, but as an idea, the idea that a nation's will could be broken by fire, that villages could be bombed into compliance, that shock and awe could substitute for understanding and strategy. In truth, the more America bombed, the stronger the resistance became, not only in Vietnam, but in America itself. The legacy was ash and doubt. For every bomb crater in Quang Binh, there was a mother's silence in Ohio. For every flattened school in Thanh Hoa, a senator's speech in Washington. For every child pulled from rubble, a student lifted a protest sign. Rolling Thunder didn't just destroy buildings, it divided a country. And when it ended in 1968, with no victory, no peace, and no apology, many Americans began asking, not what now, but what have we done? But in Vietnam, life returned. Tunnels became classrooms, cratered roads turned green again, and the people, those who had lost everything, stood up. "We buried our dead," said one villager. "Then we planted rice in the same spot. The bombers had come, but the land healed, and the spirit endured." Reflection, in the end, Operation Rolling Thunder became more than a military event. It was a chapter written in smoke and sorrow, a lesson written not in textbooks but on the skin of a country that learned to survive beneath fire. Next, episode teaser. In the next chapter, Hearts and Minds, the battle America lost without a shot. As bombs fell, another war began, one for loyalty, trust, and belief. This is the story of how America tried to win Vietnam's people, and failed.